people who are engaged in acts of terrorism, people who are so fanatic in their religion that they keep their women at home, they force them to wear the hijab, they punish them if they socialize with the Westerners, and so on and so forth. There has been a huge appetite to learn about the authentic Orient from authentic Orientals. It's very interesting. Right after 9/11, I was asked often by news media to talk about 9/11, about the situation of Islam and why Islam is radicalism. And I had to stop them and say, it was as if she told me they took away my clothes, that I was naked all of a sudden. This whole historical claims about the veiling and unveiling in Iran misses or disregards these kind of complexities and nuances. Middle Easterners who were the object of representation in classical Orientalism have now become the subject of Orientalist discourse. They are the one who are also speaking.
Can we say self-orientalism then?
It has not been discussed, and one of the contributions that I have made in the sort of the post-Saidian discussion of Orientalism is to see how relations of power in the region worked to produce a kind of an indigenous form of Orientalism. And I think it's very important to not just read these images in relationship to the West. We see this, for example, in some of the Gulf countries, their interest in Orientalist art or even Islamic art.
Hello everyone, welcome to a new episode of the Marginalised Notes podcast. I'm Ruba Abeid, and today we are recording from Doha as we attend the first international conference on Orientalism. And my guest is Professor Ali Behdad. He is a professor of English and comparative literature. He's also the director of the Near Eastern Studies Center at UCLA, and he also holds the John Charles Hillis Chair in Literature. He has written extensively on visual and literary Orientalism and Neo-Orientalism, and this is what we're actually going to discuss today. Very happy to have you today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So let's start with what is happening here at the conference, and with your presentation that was mainly discussing the idea of Neo-Orientalism. I wanted to ask you, to start with asking you, what does Neo-Orientalism mean?
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, one thing to keep in mind in thinking about Neo-Orientalism is that it is both a continuation of Orientalist discourse, but it also involves certain shifts and changes that have occurred. Orientalism, as I've discussed throughout my work, is not a stable phenomena. It's not a monolithic phenomena. It's a constantly changing discourse, depending on the political, cultural, and economic conditions that we're in. So one of the major shifts that I think has occurred in Orientalism in recent decades is a shift towards a new way of discussing the Orient that, first of all, is not just a Western discourse, but also a discourse that is created and perpetuated by people from the Middle East themselves. That is to say, Middle Easterners who were the object of representation in classical Orientalism have now become the subject of Orientalist discourse. They are the one who are also speaking.
Okay.
So that's a major shift that is I think has occurred. With that comes a series of discursive changes that I'm happy to elaborate if you want in more detail.
So you're saying that Neo-Orientalism also includes Middle Easterns themselves who are actively engaging and participating in this narrative.
Yes.
That is sort of Can we say self-orientalism then?
It is. I mean, I think that I call it self-exoticism because part of, and you can call it self-orientalizing if you wish. People have used that term. I prefer self-exoticizing because the Orient remains the other, the exotic other. So to some extent, it is really representing oneself as that exotic other. That's why I put the emphasis on self-exoticizing.
Yeah.
Now, and this happens in the domain of, for example, literary production. There has been a proliferation of memoirs by women, for example, and men from the region, especially since the tragic events of 9/11, where there has been a huge appetite to learn about the authentic Orient from authentic Orientals. And this is why people from the region have become participants in some ways. At the same time, there has been a kind of an appetite for representations that capture the condition of, say, Middle Eastern women. And that's why many visual artists, for example, Shirin Neshat or Shadi Qadirian, to just name a couple, or Leila Asadi, have been producing photographs and artistic work that to some extent perpetuates this vision of the Orient, despite the fact that these artists are indeed critical of the way women have been exoticized. The women of the Middle East have been exoticized.
So this practice is unconscious.
I think that I wouldn't call it unconscious because there are benefits to that. There are ways that you can actually, your art sells. I mean, work by Shirin Qadirian Shirin Neshat and Shadi Qadirian are extremely expensive to purchase. That's a kind of an entrepreneurial matter as well. Certain women or men who did not have access to publication, now they have access. So it is agentful. They are thinking, as subjects. They have agency in their work. But their work, I think, inadvertently sometimes gets caught up in the sort of the political discourse of Orientalism that benefits the West in many ways.
Well, this situation is easily generalizable, I think. If we look at even other examples, not necessarily in art or photography or media production, but also, for example, the phenomenon of NGOs in the region and how, or any kind of potential fundings that you might get for your media project or artistic project or even education-wise, they have specific themes, and then in order to, I don't know, have a career or continue living, you need to abide by certain themes. So you actively and voluntarily practice them for the sake of different reasons, for the sake of selling your product or earn a living, basically.
Absolutely. And I think that some of these agencies actually incentivize these, artists and writers and, people who essentially are considered experts of the region. And through fellowships, through grants, etc. Now, I don't want to, kind of generalize in the sense that every artist is that way. Quite the opposite.
Yeah, of course.
There are a diversity of artists. There are diversity of interests. Most of them, I would say, are very critical of the way the region has been represented. However, given some of their own self-interests, professional goals, career, goals, and so on, they have been, drawn into this enterprise, which is perpetuating these discourses. Now, having said that, I mean, to return to your question about Neo-Orientalism, I don't think that we need to put all the burden of Neo-Orientalist discourse on the indigenous artists and people from the region, or diaspora artists. I think there's tremendous amount of Neo-Orientalism that emanates from Western institutions, especially the media and now social media that is been happening. I think one of the shifts that happened, I would say, if I were to put my finger at certain moments in this shift from, let's say, Orientalism to Neo-Orientalism, I would say it was 9/11. What happened, I think, was that there was a new way to look at people of the region, which is through the lens of radicalism. People who are engaged in acts of terrorism, people who are so fanatic in their religion that they keep their women at home, they force them to wear the hijab, they punish them if they socialize with the Westerners, and so on and so forth. These images are produced by Western media. To this day, it is okay to say, in some circles at least, that many Middle Easterners are terrorists, and or they're living in a very patriarchal society and they're oppressive to their women, and so on and so forth. You wouldn't be able to say that towards even African Americans. I think there's an exceptionalism that has, applied or is applying to people of the region in the Middle East, especially Muslims. So there is a kind of a blurring of Muslims, Arabs, Middle Easterners, that all kind of are bundled together into one monolithic whole. That it has all these kind of characteristics. Now, that said, I think we have to take responsibility also for a certain form of Islamic radicalism that has created the context for some of these people to resort to those traditional values.
Because you said there is a shift. If we would say that Orientalism had a moment, it was 9/11. But the ideas that you mentioned about, like, the stereotypes of Muslims and Arabs being oppressive towards their women, being radical, being dogmatic, they all have roots in Orientalist discourse itself. So if I understand you correctly, is it about, like, the media production, the publicity of this narrative through media, through different forms of media, whether be it news, political discourse, arts, and so on? Is that the moment where this has been publicized and then we call it Neo-Orientalism?
Sure. This is an interesting question you're asking. It is very important to underscore the fact that Neo-Orientalism is a continuation of Orientalism. So there is certain discursive continuity between these two terms. My aim in highlighting this notion of Neo-Orientalism is to make a conceptual distinction that there was some changes, or there has been some changes occurring in the discourse of Orientalism, in the way Orientalism is being used today, that is not quite the same as the old one. Let me give you some examples of ways in which Neo-Orientalism is somewhat differs from traditional or classical Orientalism. In classical Orientalism, the people who are engaging in discourse are mostly men, and I emphasize men of letters, philologists, historians, ethnologists. These are savants, as the French would say. They are knowledgeable people. They are people who actually have studied this region, and you would say have certain interests that are scholarly. There are, of course, the people who are travelers or writers, such as Flaubert or Nerval, that reproduce the fantasy of the Orient, or in arts, Jerome or Ingres. These are, of course, fantasy realms. But the majority of what we called Orientalists were men of letters or savants. Today, Orientalists are, in fact, people who have a lot of time not much expertise. Many of them, for example, don't speak the region, the language of the region, in terms of the Western Orientalists. These are quote unquote experts. And you see them in CNN, in Fox News, and all these kind of news medias who are pontificating about the Middle East without having any knowledge of these languages or have really engaged or studied the region in any serious manner. You also have a lot of sort of Middle Easterners who use their identity as a way to claim certain knowledge. So just because I'm Iranian, I can talk about Iran.
Yeah.
Never questioning that, what is my field? It's very interesting. Right after 9/11, I was asked often by news media to talk about 9/11, about the situation of Islam and why Islam is radicalism. And I had to stop them and say, I'm actually a scholar of literature and Western literature for the most part. I have no expertise. Just because I happen to be Iranian doesn't mean that I have the expertise. So this kind of tokenistic use of Middle Easterners. So this is the first distinction. The second distinction that I would also say, there's a shift in terms of from Orientalism to Neo-Orientalism, is that a shift towards a certain form of what I would call ahistorical historicism. By that I mean, these are people, when you read their work, let's say Azar Nafisi talking about the question of the veil and the history of the veil in Iran, they make certain claims about the veil and the way that Reza Shah, let's say, forced women to not wear veil, and then the Khomeini and the Iranian Islamic government have forced women to wear the veil in ways that on the surface sounds accurate, for lack of a better word. But if you dig deep, it misses tremendous amount of nuances and complexities, historical complexities about the veil. Let's take the example of the veil in Iran. Force women to not wear, the veil. It brought tremendous amount of disadvantages to the women because religious families prevented their daughters to go to schools.
True.
Because they were now unveiled and could be seen by men. And many women, including my mother, for example, they felt violated. It was as if she told me they took away my clothes, that I was naked all of a sudden.
Wow.
That's how horrible it was. By the same token, when the Islamic Republic of Iran forced women to wear veil, in so many ways it actually provided opportunities for women, because traditional families would not send their daughters to colleges because they, could associate with men, they didn't have veil and so on. Once in universities you had to wear the veil, women were sent to school. Right now in Iran, 52% of students in universities are women. During the Shah, it was something like 8%.
Wow.
These are the subtle, not so subtle, these are the kind of changes that it speaks to the way this whole historical claims about the veiling and unveiling in Iran misses or disregards these kind of complexities and nuances of the veiling. Second element, or I should say the third element that I think is also important, and this all comes with the shift in terms of the actors. Who are the new Orientalists, versus the traditional Orientalist figure, is a certain kind of a journalistic interest in these topics. And I don't mean to undermine journalism. I think it's very important to do journalistic work. But what I mean is that the Neo-Orientalist has not really scholarly interest in these, but it's a newsworthy, or what is in the news.
Yeah.
And in that topics come and go, and we've seen some of that is sort of happening. And then the last one that I would say is this obsession, the new obsession with veiling. In the traditional Orientalist, the veil sort of was eroticized, was exoticized. It was the realm of the harem. It was about, this sensual space. Now the veil has been politicized. It's used as a sign, as a signifier of women's oppression. And that, I think, is a difference that we see in terms of this obsession. It's now entered the realm of human rights issues, women's rights issues, and so on and so forth. I don't want to defend veil or criticize it in any way. I'm just saying the way this becomes a trope in the Neo-Orientalist discourse, that's very different.
Yeah. Speaking of journalists, speaking of the case of the veil in Iran, well, I'm not going to ask a question that is specific to Iran or the veil, but because the discussion of journalists is very interesting to me, because when we talk about Orientalism or any narrative that we would like to fight back or suppress or fix or produce a counter narrative, usually when it is discussed, it is usually discussed in an academia, on an intellectual level, and we tend to forget about media and journalists themselves. Well, even in this conference, actually, I was surprised not to see like a specific session on discussing the whole thing within the journalistic practice, Orientalism within the journalistic practice, because there are so many ideas that are being taken for granted and reproduced so easily without thinking twice about it. As you said, because maybe the idea sells, people would be interested to read about an incident that has to do with the compulsory veiling of women in Iran, for example, or in Saudi. Journalists take ideas for granted. One of the very frequent things that I see, being a journalist myself, is the fascination of old photographs from the 19th century about the Middle East, different countries, and they would reproduce this content when, for example, there is a story about Syria, or there's a story about Iran, or any other country, Egypt, for example, Iraq, of course, when there has been a shift society-wise. People, well, this is not only journalists, but I'm talking about journalists because they are producers of narratives. They are actively engaging in intensifying or enhancing these narratives. And you've spoken about this, the fascination with the photographs of the Orientalist camera, or camera Orientalist, as the title of your book. To what extent does this mean that the people of the region comfortably Orientalize themselves? Does this mean that?
Yeah, let me say a few words about the context of photography of the Middle East. I think there is it's very important to distinguish two set of photographic representation of the region. The first is by European photographers who, in fact, came there to photograph the region for the purpose of their Orientalist studies, or to create images that were popular and catered to the interest, the armchair traveler and the tourists who wanted to see the region. And these images are obviously work within the kind of the Orientalist paradigm. So, for example, you have what are the types of photographs of the Middle East by Europeans that are produced? Buildings in declining or deteriorating states, historical monuments that they're trying to sort of capture the remaining civilization of the past in their photographs. Then there are photographs of people in the street scenes, and the kind of people doing their quaint work in the streets, or professions, practicing their professions, and so on. Then you have photographs that are stage photographs of supposedly harem women and so on and so forth. All of these photographs very much, for the most part, cater to the tropes of Orientalism. You know, the interest in historical architecture, the interest in kind of street scenes for the purpose of exoticism, the women, and so on and so forth. Then you have, of course, resident photographers like Abdullah Ferrer, for example, studio, who photograph both for the court, and these are representation of the court and, let's say, the Ottoman Empire, and at the same time produce a large set of images for the tourist industry. And those images, again, cater to the stereotypes of the Middle East.
Yeah. And they're still going on, like the same pattern still goes on now. If you see
Absolutely.
Advertisements for any country across the Middle East, you would see the same, you would hear this undefined, like uncategorizable music that sounds Orientalist, but you don't know where does it come from exactly.
Exactly.
You see desert scenes, you see women wearing, I don't know, a garment that is, you cannot tell where does it come from, but
Absolutely.
it appeals to the Orientalist gaze, whoever is the bearer.
Yes, the exoticism that Orientalism always embodies blurs all the kind of national, ethnic, cultural boundaries. I mean, think of, for example, Jerome's The Snake Charmer. If you look at that painting, there are people are wearing clothes that are from completely different regions. Everything from India all the way to North Africa. You know, you see sort of thing. So there is a kind of it's more than blurring of the boundaries. It's this kind of the, mishmash of, visual signifiers that have nothing to do with each other.
Yeah.
But in terms of photography, Middle Easterners did engage in act of self-representation. You see that both, let's say, in the Ottoman Empire, where Ottoman kings like Abdul Hamid, who was very interested in photography, created these images of modern Turkey in order to show that we're not backward, we're not, this sort of country still in the medieval, age. We are in fact very modern. So there will be pictures of kids in school. There will be military, equipments, firefighters, and so on. And then the same thing with, I think, the Qajar photography in Iran, where, they sort of had images of the Shah in very honorific ways. One of the arguments that I make in my book, Camera Orientalis, is that it's important to consider this photograph in the context of their productions that were used to empower the king and the court. In the same is true of empire, perhaps Ottoman Empire, although Ottomans were more sophisticated and were already, had the Tanzimat and modernization, and they felt that that aspect of their culture had to be represented and not always the traditional side of it. And that's something that I think has not been discussed. And one of the contributions that I have made in the sort of the post-Saidian discussion of Orientalism is to see how relations of power in the region worked to produce a kind of an indigenous form of Orientalism that is very local form of Orientalism, and it's about how do you represent your own people, your own different ethnicities. And you see this very strongly in the case of Ottoman. Osama Makdisi has written a wonderful piece called Ottoman Orientalism, and in his argument he shows how the Ottoman elite produce this sort of image of empire that was very hierarchical and very sort of, in some ways, exoticizing of, let's say, the Arabs, the Jews, and the Armenians, for example, the minorities, and so on.
So these kind of productions in terms of art and photography, they're not only visual materials that you might enjoy or have or represent the makers or the photographers or the painters' ideas, but they can also serve a political role.
Absolutely. I think that these photographs were instrument of power for the local power. And I think it's very important to not just read these images in relationship to the West or Western expectation of the Orient, but to see them in relation to the forces that were at work in the region, in particular in terms of consolidating certain forms of power. It's interesting that photography comes to the Middle East in the 1850s and 60s, when both Ottoman Empire and Qajar monarchy are in decline. This provides a new kind of a tool to refashion themselves and reclaim certain forms of power that were eroding at the time.
Very interesting. So how do we compare this, if we compare this with the Western production or European interest, Orientalist, I mean?
I think that the Western Orientalism and these forms of self-representation are simultaneously distinct. These are two different domains for different audiences and different political interests, and yet at the same time linked. So local artists, consider, for example, Hamdi Bey in Ottoman Empire. Distinguished figure, diplomat, artist, and so on. When you look at his paintings, they are simultaneously Orientalist, and you would say self-orientalizing, to use, that term, or self-exoticizing, and at the same time more authentic in terms of being more accurate in terms of their representation. They're more accurate in the kind of the visual vocabulary. They seem more authentic, and so on. So I think that we can think about local Orientalism or local forms of Orientalism are in fact in dialogue in some ways with Western Orientalism, in ways that simultaneously borrowing, from that tradition, and at the same time trying to liberate it from its sort of stereotypical fashion that were going on at the same time, So what I'm trying to say is that we need to think of local Orientalism simultaneously perpetuating and resisting Western Orientalism.
Okay. If we shift the conversation to considering today, like now we're talking about Neo-Orientalism, we have mentioned different practices of Neo-Orientalism, and if we look at the media production, if you'd like, or the general cultural artistic scene, do they still also play a similar kind of political role, and serving who, if this could be claimed?
I think that we see this, for example, in some of the Gulf countries, their interest in Orientalist art or even Islamic art. That we see that here, that simultaneously there is this idea of resistance to Orientalism by claiming certain objects that were belong to this region, and bringing those items home, making those our own rather than belonging to the Western museums. And that's a kind of a form of resistance, obviously. At the same time, these are also signs of power, signs of privilege, and the ability to have that kind of a political claim to certain discourses, certain artistic practices, certain political situations.
Can I ask you like a general question?
Sure.
As a concluding question. If you would, I don't know, give advice to an artist or anyone who's working with photography or any visual artistic production, and they want to represent wherever they come from, whether they have a singular identity or multiple identities, whether being expats, diaspora artists, or local artists. What advice would you give them so they don't reproduce the same stereotypical tropes?
That's a great question. To be very honest, I'm not in the business of giving advice to people, especially unsolicited advice. But I would say, I think there are two issues to keep in mind as an artist, as a writer, even as a journalist in dealing with the region. The first thing is to really have a knowledge of cultural practices in ways that are not just coming from your own experience, but have a kind of a scholarly base, a historical base. So I would say for artists who want to represent the Middle East, read more history.
Yeah.
Look at some of the documents that exist that represent this culture in the past or even in the present. So a certain profound knowledge of the region is first and foremost before you engage in any act of conversation. So that's one of the things which I think is important. The second element is that always keep in mind that the act of representation, as I like to say, is a representation. It's a mediated phenomenon. When you discuss something, you cannot be purely objective because your subjectivity always comes in. Be mindful of subjectivity and account for that subjectivity, and don't fall into these false claims of objectivity that is happening.
Yeah.
When I speak, I always say, I speak from this particular position, which is that of a professor, of a particular body of knowledge, of this particular background, of this particular context in which I live. And those, I think, make my sort of representations perhaps more nuanced, if not more authentic in that way, you know.
Yeah, that was very beautifully put. Thank you very much. So,
sure.
well-grounded knowledge and reflexivity are key for proper self-representation, at least.
Absolutely. I think that a profound knowledge, an understanding of the region and its people and its complex cultures, and at the same time being mindful of your own subjectivity, the self-reflexivity that is absolutely central to produce arts that are that can make a contribution to the region, to the people, and so on. And I would say also one other important element is to always attend to the complexities of cultures, subjectivities, and situations.
Yeah.
Middle East is not a monolithic thing.
Yeah.
Islam is not a monolithic phenomenon.
True.
There are many, many different Islams. You know, the question of the veil, for example, in Saudi Arabia is very different from the question of the veil in Iran.
Yeah, definitely.
The forms of the veil that it takes is very different in different kind of contexts. There is a culture that comes in, for example, in thinking about the veil. Sometimes that has been completely overlooked.
Yeah, true.
And this term becomes just this monolithic term.
Yeah.
That does not attend to the complexities of that.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
Professor Behdad, thank you so much for this very interesting, insightful conversation. I really enjoyed it. And I hope you have a pleasant stay in Doha.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, the pleasure is mine. Thank you.